Welcome to Lafayette We're Here, the French history podcast by a Frenchman. Today we have a special episode. We have a guest, Thérèse Rawson. She's the daughter of two very famous French musicians, and we're going to talk about her and her family. So Thérèse, please introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yes, well, I am Thérèse Rawson, as our host just said, and I am the daughter of Robert and Gaby Casadesus, who were international renowned duo pianists, but who also had individual careers. My father, Robert, and a lot with orchestra and a great deal of recordings. And my mother as well, who pursued her own career, but most of their fame probably resides in the fact that they were a unique duo piano team, and also that their life really could be said in a way. It sounds a little tacky maybe, but a piano love story, because they met at the Paris Conservatory, and then the rest is history. Now, we are talking today about a book that was just published, and this book is called My Musical Notes by Gaby Casadesus, or in English, Gaby Casadesus, and it is published on Amazon. You can find it on Amazon if you write down or click My Musical Notes by Gaby Casadesus. And the reason why I and my two sons decided to publish this year is that this year happens to be the 25th anniversary of my mother's passing. She lived from 1901 to 1999, a very long life. And she played the piano practically until maybe a week before she died. And she was also a consummate teacher as well as a performer. And we will get into that when we talk a little more about the book.
Yes. And as myself, the son of a pianist, I could appreciate all the talent of your mother and father. Yeah, I listened to many of their pieces. They're available more than I thought they would be in North America. I found lots of them like on Apple Music Classical. And I encourage everybody to have a listen to both Robert's compositions, but also their interpretations and performances of many, many pieces. They were wonderful artists. So you mentioned that they had this musical career together. So how exactly did they meet?
Oh, well, they met at the Paris Conservatory, not in the current location, the other location of the time, which was Rue Madrid in Paris. And they met really, you could almost say, in the classroom, because my father was a couple of years older than my mother, and he was already performing in the conservatory concerts and so forth. And sometimes the teachers would say, well, you need to rehearse this concerto that you're going to be playing with the school orchestra, but, we're going to call on a young pianist, a colleague of yours, to play the orchestral part in the piano reduction. That means that the orchestral part that the performer is going to play with orchestra is actually written also for a second piano. And that's how they met.
That's wonderful. So they met at the conservatory. They got married in which year?
They got married in 1921, and that was a few months, not even a few months, a few weeks before my father started teaching at the American Conservatory in Fontainebleau.
Mm.
The American Conservatory was founded, actually, the initiative was General Pershing at the end of World War One, and he wanted American musicians to get the kind of training that he had observed French military musicians to have. And so they started this program in also with Walter Damrosch, who was the head of the New York Philharmonic in those years, and was recruiting French musicians for the New York Philharmonic, as well as my great uncle, my father's uncle, Francis Casadesus, who was the one who was teaching French military music in Chaumont. And that's how he and Pershing met in 1918. And they had this project. And at the time, American soldiers could benefit from stipends from the government to study, to stay in France after their service in the war, and to continue studying music or studying the arts. And in 1923, this American conservatory, now today it's called the Fontainebleau Schools because it's two parts. The American Conservatory, very famous because of the presence of and directorship for years of Nadia Boulanger. For those who are musicians, that's a very important name. And they added a fine arts program in 1923, also available to French soldiers, but also immensely popular with American students who wanted to come and study in France.
That's nice. And I appreciate also that connection between the US and France. I mean, you're born in the US from French parents. I am, as everybody knows now, this Francophone living in North America trying to teach French history to Americans. And this connection between the two countries is so unique and so beautiful, especially when you come to the arts. The name of this podcast comes from the First World War. The Americans said, Lafayette, we're here. They came to help the French after the French helped them in the War of Independence. So it all circles back.
Yes, and we still have this program at the Fontainebleau Schools in the summer in July, both for music and fine arts. We have young professionals, actually. It's a scholarship program. And for those of you who might want to follow the group, it's called FontainebleauSchools.org. It's easy to find on Google, and it'll tell you more about the history of the schools.
Great. Yeah, I encourage people to do that, certainly. So we have this young couple of musicians, very talented, and so they become this force in music in France, both as performers and teachers. So their careers start in the 1920s, and then they go into the 1930s. So as everybody knows, those are troubled years in Europe. So can you give us like an overview of how the careers went during the 1920s and 30s?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because, first of all, there was an incredible cultural life in the 20s and 30s. Because remember, people were just coming out of World War One, which would have been the most painful episode in European history. And so they wanted to, as you probably know, if you know the period of the 20s, because it was also called in French les années folles, the mad years where people, the crazy years where people were kicking up their heels and women were wearing short clothes and short skirts, I should say, and Coco Chanel was just the rage. And in the 30s, there really wasn't the shadow of the war that much until about 1937, 38. And then for my parents, they really pursued a full blown career, a lot of traveling. And that's a very interesting part of the book. For those who are not dedicated to music, is the way people traveled in those years. They went three times to Russia in 1929, 1932, and 1936. And this is one of the most fascinating passages, I think, from a historical point of view in the book, is how people travel and what impressions they had of Russia. And they really felt the Stalinist mode of things at the end of their tours and didn't want to go back anymore. And my father's, there's also a passage in the book where he was playing in Germany in 1936. And he heard people saying at a very elegant dinner, "Oh, well, soon we're going to be in your city." So that was probably the earliest kind of hint that the Germans were going to take over France.
When I read the book, I also found these passages very interesting because your mother described the boats they traveled in and the circumstances they had to improvise a lot, I find, because those travels were organized, but sometimes some things goes wrong, or they arrive there and they don't have the room that they should have, or they don't have the people that they should have, and then your father or mother have to deal with that. And at the time, you don't have internet, you don't have cell phones, you don't have all those things, so you have to deal with them on the spot with other people. You have to send letters, it takes days. And she mentioned a few times like they're on a boat for days and days and days, and it's extremely hot. There is no AC at the time. So imagine yourself on a boat on the water with the sun blazing and you're melting in your room and just want to get there. Those are the kind of things that don't exist anymore.
And that was actually the trip to South America, which is also described in the book. Very interesting. And then a lot of train travel, including in the United States, because they had to travel, say, from Minneapolis to New Orleans in, the same week. And that's when my father actually did a great deal of composing during those train trips, which is rather remarkable. And also in hotel rooms after the rehearsal or after the concert. Few people are aware that my father was also a composer, and he composed more than 65 works for orchestra, for chamber music, for various instruments, for piano, of course. But just to give you an idea, seven symphonies, that's quite a lot. And my mother really devoted her time, particularly after my father died in 1972, and she lived another 25 years, to promoting his music, having his music performed, founding a piano competition in his name so that the candidates would get to play one of his pieces as part of the requirements. She recorded some of his music, and so this is really one of was her mission, and I continue that because I try to encourage the Fontainebleau students, the musicians, to perform some pieces by my father during the summer program.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And both those, I mean, those very human stories that you just told, the part of the composition, all the traveling, also I found made the book very much alive. You felt like you were with them during those travels, during those performances. She mentions when your father worked on his compositions, and I felt like I was alongside him, watching him work on his table. So that's a good, very beautiful aspect of the book. And something I really enjoyed reading in your book, because I listen to lots of classical music, was when your father wrote or said to your mother that often he favored rhythm over speed when in interpreting classical pieces. And he said that he found some people to be a bit too energetic, to go too fast because virtuosos could play very fast, and because they had the skill to do it. But having the skill to do it doesn't mean you should do it. And I love reading that because often I listen to classical music, especially piano, and you have those wonderful musicians who can play at amazing speeds, but it distracts. You can't appreciate the piece as much as you would if they would slow down a tad. And to me, that means your father understood that more than most musicians.
Oh, absolutely. And my mother as well. I would say one of their mantras, you would say, was to follow the composer, and particularly the composer's markings, because on scores, there are markings that tell you to go a certain tempo and whatever. And they respected that to the letter. And this is not what many musicians do. They want to show off their technical skills, for instance. And also, my father his ancestry was Catalan, from Catalonia. And he was very influenced by Spanish music, which is very rhythmic. So in his compositions, there's a great deal of rhythm. But the other thing is that my parents were both close friends of Maurice Ravel. And Ravel was also influenced very much by the Spanish type of music. Manuel de Falla was one of my father's favorites, and as well as Ravel. And Ravel and my father performed together in concerts in Spain back in the 20s. And that's when their friendship really developed. My father was the greatest fan of Ravel, gave the first full length Ravel recital in Paris in 1923, I think it was. So that was quite remarkable. And Ravel invited my father to record piano rolls. Can you imagine piano rolls? Back in London in 1923. And he said, I'm going to take you with me because you can play the harder pieces better than I can. And it is actually at an evening, a soiree after that my parents got to hear this amazing Hungarian violinist who was the inspiration for this work, so famous work by Ravel for violin and piano called Tzigane. And this year is the 100th anniversary of the first performance of this Tzigan. And my parents remember Raphael saying, I was so impressed by this young lady, I'm going to go home right now and I'm going to write a piece inspired by her.
All those, you could say, celebrities that your parents worked with. It's amazing. You mentioned Maurice Ravel, but Arturo Toscanini, Francis Poulenc. I really enjoy reading his name. He's a personal hero of mine. His organ concertos are just absolutely amazing, but he's not very well known from the general public nowadays.
Well, actually, I happen to have taught for many years at the Curtis Institute of Music, and my specialty was actually teaching French diction to singers. And in the era, unfortunately, which is it's dying a little bit now, was there was still in the 80s and 90s an interest in the vocal recital and vocal recital, many students, of course, and with sometimes my suggestion, perform the wonderful songs of Poulenc, Francis Poulenc. And so, yeah, his vocal music is also remarkable. And there's a wonderful anecdote in the book about my mother and Francis Poulenc going shopping together. And that is really fun. He loved to go to Les Halles, which was a big shopping emporium right in the heart of Paris. Unfortunately, now it's been moved outside. And it was a market where if you went very early in the morning, you would have all the farmers had brought all their goods or all their foods. And Poulenc was very fond of going there and took my mother with him, and the two of them had a wonderful time.
The book is full of those little stories that, as I said, make it very much alive and very beautiful. So another celebrity that struck me as rather funny, your mother worked with, was Albert Einstein. Apparently, he was her neighbor. So before we get to him, so in the 1930s, we have your parents, globetrotters, performing everywhere, being invited in all the best concert halls in the world. And then the war happens. So we're in 1940. We have those two French pianists, world renowned. What is the reaction? What did they had to do when the war broke out and they understood what was going on?
Oh, well, that was a very difficult time because even in the summer of 39, they left Paris with my two brothers. I wasn't born yet, and they were respectively about 11 and 7 at the time. And there had been already threats that Paris might get bombed, even before 1940. And so they settled for a few months in Vichy, and then the American tour of my father usually took place in the winter months. And he had started coming to perform in the States in 1935, and they had a yearly tour, and it was actually at this concert with the New York Philharmonic in 1935 that Toscanini was in the audience, and he said, "You are a remarkable pianist, and I am so impressed that you chose to play a Mozart concerto, which was not considered a showcase, kind of piece with technical difficulties and so forth, but just a depth of feeling and emotion." And Toscanini said, "I want you to play on my series next year." And so after that, and actually at the time, it was the French Cultural Ministry that exported their best artists all over the world. And that's how my father, in a way, got his start in 1935. And then, of course, once he was recognized by Toscanini, then he didn't need any sponsorship anymore. The agents, took him and then sent him all over the United States. But that was a little later. So in 39, they're already worried about what they're going to do. And they're saying, are we going to take the boys to the States in January or not? And so that was a very difficult decision. And everybody, the relatives said, you better take them because we don't know what's going to happen. So they got a passage on an Italian ship in January 1940, and they settled for a few months in New York. And then my parents said, it's not so good because the boys are going to the French lycée, but they're not learning English. And my parents had already quite a lot of American friends from having come in the mid 30s and students as well. And they all said, oh, you should go to Princeton because the boys all have schools with athletics and, what a regular American boy should have. And also, there's a wonderful expat community in Princeton. And of course, among others, was Einstein.
So Einstein, everybody knows the physicist, but not everybody knows he was also a violinist. Well, an amateur one, but from what I understand, fairly capable. So how those sessions go between your mother and Einstein?
Oh, this was very interesting because, as I say, they were practically neighbors. I mean, he lived down the street, so to speak, and of course, he was living with his, I believe it was his stepsister and his niece, and they would, invite new people to tea, and so that was the first relationship. And then very soon, of course, he knew that my parents were pianists. And he said, "Oh, I love to play the violin." And he said to my mother, "Maybe we could do a little bit of chamber music together." And so they did occasionally. And then Princeton club called the Present Day Club or something like that wanted to organize a big concert as a benefit for French relief. That meant to send food, packages, and help to the French during the occupation. And so they invited my mother and Einstein to play together. And it was a huge hit, as you can well imagine. They played Mozart. And my mother, this is a cute little anecdote, and she said that that's something from me. Don't think it's in the book, because she said, when we were rehearsing, I had to tell him to stop him once, and I said, "I can understand how you can't keep time." And she said to me, "Now that I think back, how could I dare to have said something like that to Einstein?" He said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Let's start this part over again."
It's especially funny considering what he brought to physics has to do with time.
Exactly. You can't keep time.
That's quite funny. So,
Yes.
so they had the chance to avoid being in occupied France. So they were wise to make that
But
decision.
there's another aspect to
Yes.
that, and that is that they were supposed to go back in April 40.
Hmm.
And then run the Fontainebleau program in the summer, which they had been doing, which had been going on since 1921. And they received I guess it was a telegram or a letter from the Ministry of Culture, who said, "Oh, you can't use the Fontainebleau grounds, the palace. It's a big palace, about an hour southeast of Paris, and it's a beautiful place to visit." If you haven't been to France, or in any case, they said you can't use the chateau for your school because we have to requisition it for military training. And so we hope that you will be able to do the program in the States, since it's called the American Conservatory, and that American students are the primary students there. This is no longer the case. Now it's much more international. And so they said, "Well, I guess we will try to do that." And immediately my mother went to work. She was an amazing organizer. And she actually was very helpful as a manager for my father's career. And she went to ask people around and where could we do it and so forth. And so they did it for 2 summers in Newport, Rhode Island, and they used the grounds of the George School, which is a school that still exists today. And so they had the full music program there in the summer. And then 1942, 3, 4, 5, they did the program in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and that was very close to Tanglewood. And Tanglewood was already a very famous summer music festival, which had been founded by Sergei Kusevitsky, who had actually started his career in Paris and then came to be the leader of the Boston Symphony for decades and always promoted French music in his programming. And actually, he had been a friend of my father's uncle, Henri, another Casadesus, because the Casadesus, as you saw in the book, were a real tribe, a family of musicians. And so this Tanglewood location was particularly fortuitous because that's when my father met Zino Francescatti. And they started doing some chamber music for fun, and then they became also a very famous duo, piano violin. So not two pianos, four hands, or two piano concerti, like they were. It was with my mother, but piano violin, and the very famous recordings as well, particularly the Beethoven sonatas. I recommend that for those of you who will be listening to more music.
That's always a good thing to do, especially with such beautiful artists. So we have your parents. They managed to keep teaching in the U.S. They keep performing, meeting other artists, and that's where you were born. So you were born in 1942 in the United States. So how was it for you being this young kid from French parents in the States and having to grow up in that environment?
Well, I would say, first of all, I had a very, very happy years in Princeton. Went to school. I had really sort of the 50s or late 40s, 50s life of an American kid. But of course, I was expected to practice the piano every day. And my mother was afraid that I would forget French. So she had a tutor come to the house 2 or 3 times a week. She was a French lady she was actually what they called a war bride, a lady who had met an American soldier and come to live in Princeton, and of course she was completely fluent, and she would make sure that I went over sort of the curriculum of my grade, so that when we went back to France when I was 10 years old. The transition, I did not have to skip a grade or repeat a grade. But my goodness, the atmosphere was so incredibly different because it was still kind of post-war. Post-war France, in some ways, I mean, it was certainly not how it had been, right after the occupation. But there was still people were still kind of a bit mistrustful of each other. It was kind of still a bit of a dark time. I would say that the mid 50s is when France really came out of the war and became very successful with cultural life and everything else. But I don't remember having a very positive impression of moving back to France compared to being a child in the States.
Yeah, I read that in the book. And from, as I said, my father was born in 43 in Paris. And he told me about that period in France when he was a young kid that, coming out of the war, the country's traumatized, lots of destruction, as you said, lots of mistrust, who was a resistant fighter, who was a collaborator. There was a lot of that. So the ambiance was rather dark compared to the US, where you had this beautiful childhood. Good for you. I mean, the contrast could not have been stronger.
It was, and it was so sad for my parents when they came back to France. I was only about 4 years old, so that was a little different. That was earlier, before I went to school in France, and they had told me as a child, oh, you're going to see this beautiful country, and all I saw on that train ride from Le Havre to Paris were ruins. And I still think back, I can't imagine how I could have, reacted. And to them to see this child, kind of just thunderstruck because of course, and they didn't know either that they were going to see the country in ruins. It's very difficult for them as well, the re-entry to France. And also, yes, because of this atmosphere of, who had been a collaborator, who had been a resistance, and this and that. And of course, the apartment that my parents had lived in, my goodness, we still have a plaque at the 54 Rue Vanneau in the 7 recognizing that my parents lived there for decades, and it had been kind of wrecked. So, and they also, what was very painful during the Second World War for them was being away from their relatives. Both my mother's father and my father's father died in 1940, mostly because of poor medical care. And my father's beloved aunt died in 1944. My mother's sister died later, but my mother was constantly worried about the family.
Of course. Okay. And there was no way to get news during the war, I imagine.
Yes, it was very difficult. And my father, because he never became fluent in English, listened to Radio Canada. That's how he got his news. And he was, really had his ear glued to the radio to try to get news. And it was not easy.
Yeah, and I can imagine. I mean, they live the warriors in the States, and then you come back to this ravaged country, which is not a souvenir that they had. In their mind, it was still this beautiful 1939 France, and they come back to this country that has been ravaged by war and occupation for years. So that must have been quite the experience.
Yes, which is important from a historical point of view, is that the orchestras had also been devastated. Why? Because of the Holocaust, because so many Jewish musicians had died. And so the orchestras were decimated in terms of musicians, and it took a number of years to build them back up.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff people don't think when they think about the Holocaust. It ravaged many stratas of society, including the artistic world, of course. Nevertheless, you come back to France with your parents, and how did their careers change, I would say, in the 1950s and 60s?
Well, actually, their careers really blossomed. Well, my father did more traveling, I would say, throughout Europe, and particularly with his favorite orchestra in Europe was the Concertgebouw in Holland. And but every year he went to Germany, he went to Holland, he went to, but of course, that was the time of the Iron Curtain, so he could not really go back to Russia and Poland, where they had been before the war, and they had been so acclaimed in those countries, and it was kind of sad because they missed that. And but little by little, things opened up. I mean, I remember actually going with my parents to Budapest in 1956, just after the Russians had come into Budapest. And yeah, I mean, those are amazing times. And my parents performed, of course, in Paris and through there was a time in the mid 50s where all these special festivals were created. Aix-en-Provence, Mai Musicale de Bordeaux. And so they performed at these festivals on a regular basis in the summers or May or whatever time of year. And that was especially, they were in demand as a duo, four hands.
Yeah, I understand that your brother was also an active part of their act in the 1950s and 60s.
Yes. Now, I had a brother much older than I who was a pianist. And even though my parents would have preferred for him to be a conductor, because everybody said, oh, it's going to be so hard for you to make a career stepping in your father's shoes and this and that and the other. But no, he wanted to do the piano. And he won an award when he was about 18 or 19, and he played for the Young Concert Artists. And the conductor of the New York Philharmonic of the time was Dimitri Mitropoulos. And he heard Jean, and he said to my parents, well, your son is very talented, like you are. And why don't you think of being a three piano team? Which is very unusual. There is not a lot of repertoire for three pianos. And so he suggested that they perform, and they did. Bach three piano concerto. Now, of course, it was written for harpsichord, but people were not as what purists as they became later about only playing Bach on the harpsichord and not on the piano and so forth. Now, of course, you adjust your playing to play Bach. You don't put a lot of pedal and stuff like that. But anyway, and Mozart wrote a three piano concerto. So that's what they started doing that. And very quickly they did recordings, and then they even did a very famous video, which is available still today on DVD from a company called VAI, which has archival DVDs of famous performers of the past. And it is called The First Family of the Piano. And it was filmed in 1967. And it's really, for those who really want the visual, you will see this three piano team called the First Family of the Piano. And they get also in little intimate, day to day things where they lived and, things like that. It's about, I would say, maybe 50 minutes.
So you have your parents doing that, and so that's in the 50s and 60s. So you're a teenager at this time. So what were you doing during this time period?
Well, actually, I was very academic. I had decided at the age of 13, which seems young, but not to pursue any kind of career in piano and music in general. And I was more interested in studies, so I went to lycée. And lycée was demanding, and it still is. I mean, the French educational system, as you know, is more demanding than the American. And so now it's changing, but in those days it certainly was. And so I was very bookish. And then, of course, I didn't really have the kind of teenage life that an American child has. Again, not because of the post war, but just because things were, in a way, much less free. It was still a fairly kind of conservative in France in those days. And when I compare, for instance, with my husband, well, my husband didn't have wild teenage years either. I guess maybe we have that commonality is that we're a little more like, interested in our own pursuits, and we were not, just running around with kids. But yeah, things were much more conservative in France in those years. The big change, I'm sure you've mentioned that on your podcast, in France, the loosening up happened in 1968. But before that, things were fairly, even though you had, the movies, the new movies, you had the nouveau roman. I mean, in culture, you had a lot of new things, but not so much in daily life for people.
Yeah, it took some time. And then there was this big break, as you mentioned, in 68. I did mention it during my episode on Charles de Gaulle. You witnessed that from the first row. And my parents talked to me about it, of course, because they were there.
There was another thing to mention from those years, which was the Algerian War, because that started in the mid 50s, and my second brother was in the army, and of course that was a very worrisome time for my mother in particular, because it was a little bit like Vietnam for the U.S.
Yes, it's a traumatizing conflict, and many young men lost their lives basically for nothing. It was, as I mentioned, my dad, he was a year from going. He was doing his military service during the war, and the war ended just before he was scheduled to go, so he was lucky. But yeah, it affected many French families, and only a decade and a half after the Second World War. So we're still fresh from that war, going into another, and I'm not even mentioning the Indochina War, which happens in the 40s and 50s, which are so that was a period that was very troublesome and hard for France. The French inflicted part of it on themselves, of course, because those are colonial wars. But nevertheless, it had a very strong and ill effect on young people that had nothing to do with it, including your brother and your parents. We're now in the 1960s, entering the 70s. So your parents are world-renowned musicians. Your brother is one of them too. And that brings us to 1972, which is when I read this, I mean, it was hard to read this very tough year for your family. Can you walk us through it? What happened?
Oh yes, it was such a drama because my brother died in a car accident. And actually, interestingly enough, he was traveling in Canada, and it was in the winter, and there was I don't know, the plane to go from one place to the other the flight was canceled because of the snow. And he met somebody in the airport and said, I have to get over to this town of, I think it was called Trois-Rivières, and why don't we just rent a car? And so the guy needed to also, for work reasons or whatever, get to the place where he was going. So they rented a car together, and the snowstorm, terrible visibility, and they had a terrible, fatal car crash. My brother was only 44 years old, and that was in January 72. And of course, it was devastating for all of us. You can well imagine. And my father had a much worse reaction, I would say emotionally. He'd shut down. He didn't want to play the piano anymore. He didn't want to give concerts anymore. But little by little, they went back to France within a month. And my mother, very much, who has such a positive, energetic personality, managed to tell him that he had commitments with concerts. So that kind of got him back on track a little bit. She, on the contrary, was kind of the strong one, and even though she was, for a mother to lose her oldest son is probably one of the saddest things. And so she basically felt that she had to be the strong one. And so she encouraged my father to get back to performing, which was not easy, but he did. But then, unfortunately, and I believe that that was a result of the shock, that he developed a very quick moving pancreatic cancer. And so by September 19 of 1972, he died. Now, of course, in those days, you didn't have the treatments for this type of cancer that you have today, but it's still a fatal cancer in many cases. And so after that, my mother immediately got into, she was a fighter, and she said, I am not going to let go. I am going to devote myself to promoting Robert's music. And very quickly, she got into the project of founding a piano competition called the Robert-Casadesus International Piano Competition in Cleveland. And why in Cleveland? Two reasons. Number one, the head of the Cleveland Institute was a wonderful pianist by the name of Grant Johannesson, American pianist, who had studied with my father back in the great Barrington days in the 40s. And he said, we could do the competition there. And the other reason is that my father's favorite conductor and friend in all his recordings was George Sell. And George Sell had been for decades the conductor, director of the Cleveland Symphony. So it was a very good place to do it because my father's reputation was there. There was an interest of people from the orchestra, people from the board, and so forth. And so it went on for 20 years. And then we, as a family, decided to stop because they wanted to commercialize it a little bit more like the Van Cliburn competition, and we didn't think that was what my father would have wanted. So, and my mother continued performing. That was the amazing thing. There was a concert that was scheduled at the Metropolitan Museum in December of 72 with the Guarneri Quartet, I believe it was. And she said, well, Robert can't do it. And the quartet said, why don't you do it? She said, you mean I'm going to be playing with you instead of Robert? And they said, sure, of course. You're just as good a pianist as he is. And so they played a Mozart quintet and, whatever. But she just went right back to performing and recorded some of his music as well.
She was very, very strong. I mean, as you said, those two blows that she had to suffer and you had to suffer in that year. I mean, your brother, your father. I mean, I had kind of a similar experience myself in recent years. My half-sister died in 2020 and my father died in 2022. And she died of pancreatic cancer. I can say that I can relate really much to what you experienced because you were younger, but still, I can see, and my mother died when I was 19 of cancer. So I can see those experiences, how they affect your life, So those things talk to me a bit. I'm getting a bit more personal than I usually do in this podcast, but that's fine. And it's the kind of thing that, I think resonates with people because I'm citing my case, but many people have these experiences in their lives. They lose a father or a brother or a sister, what have you. And it is in that book and it is in this interview with you. And I think it touches people. And what I find remarkable is how your mother coped with that. I mean, she was as struck as anybody would be. I mean, her son, her long life. They'd been together for 50 years at this point. I can imagine.
Yes, exactly. They had just celebrated their 50th wedding
Exactly. So,
anniversary. But one thing I want to point out about my mother throughout her performing and their careers is that she had always been very much, how may I put it, a support for my father, and she was very practical. She would come to the rehearsals. She would say, this piano hasn't been tuned right. You should ask to have it retuned, or the acoustics are not good in this room, and things like that. She was a major part of his career, let's put it that way. And he, on his end, wanted very much his wife to continue her own career. And she did some orchestral performances, she did some recordings, and mostly I would say the time she was the busiest was really when she was in the States in the 40s. That's when she did a lot of recordings. Of course, they recorded the dual pianos.
So she kept going after your father's passing, and I would now the question I would ask you. So we have those two wonderful artists. What to you? I mean, they're musicians, teachers, globetrotters. They had remarkable, extraordinary lives, and they have impacted many people during those lives. So, what to you is their legacy?
Or their legacy. Well, I would say it was mostly in the case of my mother. It was very much her teaching legacy, and because she was really a teacher at heart. My father gave master classes on interpretation and things like that. He was not into teaching the way my mother was. She even wrote a book of exercises, which is called My Daily Technique, and she partnered with a professor who's still at the Juilliard School, a composer also by the name of Philippe Lasserre, kind of a Franco-American as well. And she wrote this book of exercises and interpretations and fingerings. She had a very strong influence on many, many, many of those students who came to Fontainebleau in the summers, the 70s and the 80s, even into the 90s. And I would say she even did she published some scores with Schirmers, where she had the fingerings of Ravel. She did the works by Ravel. And so basically, that's exactly what she did. Her legacy was very much her teaching. As far as my father, it's the recordings. Sony Classical did a box set back in 2019, and there are 66 recordings of my father alone, my father with my mother, my father with my mother and my brother, with Zeno Francescati. I mean, it's a huge compendium. But you can also find some works on Spotify, and you will find my parents there, and even one on YouTube if you scroll way, way down of Ravel's Jeu d'eau, and there's a wonderful picture of my mother in the 40s because she recorded that. And, you will, if you dig around a little bit, and there is a website called the robertcasadesus.com website, which, of course, is very helpful if you want to find more resources and the discography and the list of compositions and so forth.
I found many of them on Apple Music also, or especially Apple Music Classical. They have many of those pieces. So we have recordings from your father, your mother. It's just fantastic what we can find today. That's a great advantage of these services. Allows you to discover those artists. If you were to recommend one or two pieces to people who don't know your father's music at all, what would you recommend?
Okay. Well, one I would recommend that I'm particularly fond of it was written, of course, for the two of them, and it's called Danse Méditerranéenne. Now that might be a little harder to find. Other wonderful works that I love are piano four hands, are Petite Suite by Debussy, Ma Mère Loire by Ravel, Dolly by Fauré, and of course some Chabrier, which is not as well known a composer, Emmanuel Chabrier, and wonderful forehand, piano forehand pieces. Now, in my father's compositions, I love the Danse Méditerranéenne, but I also love his series called Huit Études pour Piano, which were written in the late 40s. Yeah, no, late 30s, and which were recorded by my mother. So that might be found. Now, as I say, Ravel, Fauré, Debussy were the three composers that my parents performed the most. And Mozart.
I really encourage listeners to find those recordings, sit down, and just appreciate the music. I mean, it's wonderful to listen to. I did listen to quite a few myself before today, and because I knew the Casadesus name because of my dad, but I can't say that I knew Robert's compositions, and opened a whole new world to me. So I appreciate that. To circle back, so the whole reason for this interview today, the first story, is because of your mother's book, My Musical Notes, Journey in Classical Piano Between the World Wars and Beyond, by Gaby. As you said, people can find it on Amazon. I think it's also available in many booksellers, so wherever you get your books, you'll find it easily. I will put a note in the show notes so people can easily find it. It's a sweet read. It's also a quick read. I mean, it's not a huge book, so don't be shy. Get it, have a fun reading it, and read it while listening to your father's music, might as well. So to really appreciate the whole thing. So Thérèse, it was a real pleasure talking to you. I hope people find out your book, find your parents' music, and have a good time with it. So to everybody, au revoir. See you next time.
Au revoir.
You can find the Lafayette We're Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lafayette Podcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.